The hearing was already tense when Jasmine Crockett took the floor, but no one in the chamber truly grasped what was about to unfold. With a controlled demeanor and carefully prepared documentation in hand, she began her questioning in a manner that initially seemed routine. But slowly, the focus narrowed. She brought up Jeffrey Epstein's name not as a vague allusion, but as the centerpiece of a deliberate unveiling. What began as procedural inquiry swiftly turned into a stunning display of research and revelation, without raising her voice or showing signs of performance. Crockett began reading from what she called unreleased but authenticated materials. She referenced flight logs originals, not secondary sources. The names listed were familiar to some, but hit harder when she spoke them under oath and in public. Politicians, billionaires, foreign dignitaries. Then, with a careful pause, she stated his name. She didn't just say it once. She read off a detailed timeline that listed him as a passenger on Epstein's private jet, specific dates, destinations, and in one instance, the name of a female passenger who had been listed in a now-sealed deposition from a 2015 civil case. The room changed. At first, the murmur from the audience was minor, but within seconds, a wave of disbelief rippled through the hearing hall. Members of both parties shifted uncomfortably. Some tried to interrupt her, but she pressed forward. Her tone didn't rise. When focus never wavered. She cited a private gathering at Epstein's New York townhouse in 2002, cross-referenced with visitor logs and an email chain obtained through a recent FOIA request filed by an independent investigative journalist. In that exchange, the former president was described as confirming attendance alongside others whose ties to Epstein had already been widely scrutinized. A photograph was entered into the congressional record, previously unseen, dated, time-stamped, and verified. It showed him in Epstein's home library. The frame captured him speaking with Epstein and two unnamed young women. Crockett stated clearly that facial recognition had been used to authenticate the image and that metadata had not been tampered with. No one interrupted her after that. Her delivery wasn't accusatory, it was forensic. No adjectives, no speculations. Just documents, dates, and connections. As she flipped to another page, she revealed an itinerary sent via fax in 1997, an invitation to a private event at Epstein's Palm Beach residence, where, according to sealed testimony, Crockett referenced, without disclosing explicit content, several underage girls had been present and paid. She noted that he had RSVP'd to the event in a signed note, allegedly verified through handwriting analysis conducted during a 2008 investigation. The signature was displayed on the screen behind her. That's when the cameras focused tightly on her, then scanned the room. Reactions were subdued, not because they were casual, but because the gravity of the information had settled like a fog over the hearing. Even those who had defended him vigorously in the past were left without their usual talking points. Crockett had gone beyond media narratives and brought material that demanded legal and ethical reconsideration. She ended her statement by noting that the evidence had been authenticated by a third-party archivist and submitted to Federal Oversight Council earlier that morning. She reminded everyone that while association isn't proof of guilt, transparency was non-negotiable when the safety of minors and the misuse of power intersect. Her language was precise and restrained, but the implications were clear. For those watching live. It felt like watching the pages of a sealed file open for the first time. Unlike the many times his name had come up in connection to Epstein only, to be brushed aside as hearsay or politically motivated gossip, this was different. It was structured, sourced, and delivered within the framework of a formal hearing. Crockett didn't grandstand or point fingers. She simply illuminated what had been kept in the dark. Within minutes of her finishing, news outlets began reporting on the specific documents she cited. Analysts and legal commentators began questioning the contents, while others focused on how she had obtained them. But one thing was certain. The link she drew between him and Epstein wasn't just another footnote in a scandal, it had become part of the official record. The response from Donald Trump was unlike anything his team or the public had seen before. In a man known for his bombast, his reflexive aggression, and his tendency to confront controversy head-on with denial or deflection, his silence following Jasmine Crockett's revelations was louder than any tweet he could have typed. The moment her statement concluded, there was a noticeable scramble within Trump's inner circle. Staffers who had been monitoring the live hearing reportedly began texting one another frantically, trying to assess the severity of the documents Crockett had introduced. He had been scheduled to appear at a closed-door strategy meeting that same evening, where campaign donors and legal advisors were planning to align messaging for the week. According to two insiders familiar with the matter, Trump abruptly canceled the meeting with no formal explanation. What followed was a rare media blackout from him. No truth social posts, no appearances on conservative outlets, no bombastic clips circulated to counter the narrative. It wasn't a calculated pause, it was confusion. Behind the scenes, his legal team began a damage control operation. Sources close to the former president described the atmosphere as tense and reactive. Attorneys were immediately tasked with verifying the authenticity of the documents presented by Crockett. Some advisors even speculated whether there had been a breach, how she could have accessed materials believed to be sealed. The concern wasn't just about the optics, there was fear about what might come next. If Crockett had these, what else had surfaced without their knowledge? Those who have worked with Trump during previous crises noted that his usual mode of operation would involve redirecting public attention, perhaps by launching an attack on Crockett's credibility or calling the hearing a witch hunt. But none of that happened. Instead, there was an eerie kind of stillness, marked by hurried meetings and internal investigations. According to a person briefed on the matter, he was visibly rattled and demanded to know if the materials were leaked from within one of the Epstein-related civil cases still pending in New York. His aides didn't have answers. Compounding the tension was the media's reaction, as news outlets played the clips of Crockett reading off flight records and showing the authenticated image of Trump in Epstein's townhouse. Producers debated how far they could go in framing the segment. The legal risk was evident, but so was the significance of the moment. Within hours, the story dominated headlines, not just because it connected Trump to Epstein, but because the documents brought new weight to a topic many assumed was exhausted. Inside Mar-a-Lago, the mood was somber. One staffer described the former president as deeply preoccupied, pacing, making calls non-stop. He reportedly asked for a full review of every document Crockett cited and demanded a briefing from his legal advisors on whether her public disclosure had crossed any lines. The anxiety wasn't limited to legal exposure. It extended to political implications. His campaign staff worried about donor reaction, especially those who had tolerated controversies in the past, but were already uneasy about his connection to Epstein. Despite the mounting concern, Trump did not make a formal statement. Instead, a vague press release was issued the next morning from a campaign spokesperson, referring to partisan theatrics and manipulated information. Though it avoided naming Crockett directly or addressing the contents of the evidence, legal observers quickly pointed out the strategic vagueness. It allowed for deniability without confronting the substance of the allegations. But to many, it felt like a retreat. Allies in conservative media were equally uncertain. Some commentators chose to ignore the story entirely. Others attempted to shift the focus back to President Biden or the Justice Department. But the vacuum Trump left behind was noticeable. It was as if, for the first time in a long time, the former president wasn't sure how to fight back. His silence didn't come off as strength, it read as concern. Privately, his team floated the possibility of launching a preemptive legal challenge to suppress further discussion of the Epstein documents. However, some lawyers warned that doing so might validate the authenticity of what Crockett had exposed and invite even more scrutiny. For now, they advised monitoring media reactions, gauging political fallout, and preparing for follow-ups that might come from other lawmakers emboldened by Crockett's move. In a matter of hours, the man who once thrived on dominating headlines found himself forced into the unfamiliar position of reacting instead of controlling. And every hour that passed without a full-throated response made it clear. Something about what had been aired had struck a nerve. As soon as Jasmine Crockett concluded her presentation, the media response ignited at a pace rarely seen, even in Washington's most explosive moments. Newsrooms scrambled to verify the documents she had cited: flight logs, sealed testimonies, internal emails, and while Crockett hadn't dramatized the delivery, the substance was enough to shift editorial priorities across the board. Suddenly, every network was running segments not only on her statements, but on what they might mean for Donald Trump, especially in the context of his long-denied association with Jeffrey Epstein. Major cable outlets went live with emergency panels. Legal analysts began dissecting the implications of the image. Crockett had submitted a photograph that, though simple in appearance, showed Trump and Epstein's Manhattan residence with individuals who had previously been identified in other Epstein-related investigations. The photo had never been seen by the public before, and its inclusion in the congressional record made it a matter of formal documentation rather than mere speculation. Reporters immediately began cross-referencing the photo with known timelines of Trump's travel during the early 2000s, noting that it lined up with at least one date in the flight logs Crockett had cited. Social media platforms lit up with side-by-side comparisons of Crockett's documentation and previously denied claims from Trump. Within minutes, hashtags linking him to Epstein surged trending positions globally. On X, formerly Twitter, journalists posted clips of the hearing while overlaying them with archived statements from Trump denying any significant connection to Epstein. The contrast was glaring. Crockett had offered detailed, time-stamped data. In contrast, his past dismissals now seemed insufficient or even strategically evasive. Some commentators initially hesitated, concerned about the legal ramifications of amplifying materials that may have come from sealed sources. But the fact that a sitting member of Congress had entered them into the official record provided enough journalistic cover for networks to proceed. On CNN, a constitutional law expert explained how Crockett had used congressional privilege to bring the materials forward, meaning they were now part of public legislative history. That shift from rumor to record was what truly opened the floodgates. Within the political ecosystem, reactions began pouring in. Democratic strategists called it a moment of reckoning. Progressive figures praised Crockett's discipline in avoiding showmanship while still landing what many called the most significant political exposure of Trump's Epstein ties to date, but even within conservative circles, there was visible discomfort. A few right-wing pundits cautiously acknowledged the gravity of the hearing. Others attempted to deflect by revisiting previous stories about Epstein's ties to other political elites. But the center of attention had already landed on Trump and it wasn't moving. In the hours that followed, questions multiplied. News anchors asked how Crockett had acquired the material, and if more disclosures were coming. Analysts debated whether the Department of Justice would now face renewed pressure to revisit Epstein's associations more aggressively, especially considering the extent of the materials Crockett had surfaced. Legal scholars noted that while association isn't proof of criminal wrongdoing, the specificity of what she cited event records, confirmations of attendance, and the presence of underage girls at several listed gatherings could warrant further inquiry, if not from law enforcement, then certainly from the court of public opinion. Even typically neutral outlets like Reuters and AP led with headlines questioning the political and reputational implications for Trump. Investigative reporters began pulling threads from the hearing, attempting to locate copies of the sealed depositions Crockett referenced. At least one media outlet claimed it had already located a related set of documents through a whistleblower but had previously held off publishing due to legal ambiguity. Now, with the information exposed in a formal hearing, they felt free to proceed. As the story spread globally, international outlets joined in. European news networks, already attuned to the Epstein story due to Prince Andrew's involvement, framed Trump's appearance in Crockett's timeline as a new chapter in an old scandal. Several papers in the UK and France printed front-page spreads the next morning showing the image of Trump in Epstein's library, alongside excerpts from the flight log Crockett had cited. Back in Washington, members of Congress from both parties were being asked for comment. Most Republicans deflected, a few downplayed the significance, calling it political theater. But behind closed doors, some were reportedly asking for private briefings, trying to determine whether the evidence was as legitimate and as damning as it appeared. And still, Trump remained largely silent. The media, usually saturated with his rebuttals and sound bites, was now filled instead with legal analysis, historical connections, and unanswered questions. The control of the narrative, once his signature strength, had been completely taken out of his hands. Jasmine Crockett's composure throughout the hearing became almost as notable as the content of her revelations. In a political environment where volume often substitutes for substance, she stood out for the opposite. She didn't grandstand. She didn't raise her voice. She read from documents, displayed timelines, and introduced evidence as if she were presenting to a jury, not the press. And by the time she concluded, she had completely shifted the tone of the hearing. The room, normally buzzing with side conversations and partisan muttering, had fallen into an unusual silence. Everyone knew they had witnessed something serious. Her demeanor wasn't accidental. Colleagues close to her said later that she had spent weeks preparing for that moment, consulting with legal experts, and requesting authenticated documents. Through proper oversight channels, the aim wasn't to create a viral moment, it was to force transparency. The materials she introduced didn't rely on innuendo or selectively edited quotes. They were specific, and more importantly, they were now part of the congressional record. Among those materials was a previously unseen communication between Epstein's legal team and an unnamed associate, where Donald Trump's name appeared in the context of coordinating travel arrangements to a private island event. Crockett didn't editorialize. She simply read the note aloud, identifying the dates and the associated travel logs that corroborated the timeline. The fact that she didn't follow it with commentary made it even more unsettling for those watching. She wasn't selling a narrative, she was presenting a puzzle that, piece by piece, appeared to align. Reporters noticed immediately how rare it was for a politician to handle such explosive information with restraint. As one legal commentator on MSNBC noted, she didn't need to editorialize. She had the receipts, and she trusted people would understand what they meant. That trust in the power of facts, especially in an environment increasingly defined by spectacle, gave her revelations an unusual kind of weight. Even her fellow lawmakers seemed unsure how to respond in the moment. Some avoided eye contact. A few Republican members quietly left the room during her presentation, citing unrelated business. though it was clear the discomfort had grown too intense. There were no shouted objections, no procedural interruptions, only the low hum of unease as she methodically laid out names, dates, and destinations. What was striking was how deliberately she avoided using language that might allow Trump or his allies to dismiss her as simply partisan. She never accused him of committing a specific crime. She never speculated on motive. She simply showed that his name was connected to Epstein in more direct, documentable ways than he had previously acknowledged. That distinction proved critical. By refusing to indulge in rhetoric, she had denied him the rhetorical escape routes he typically used. When reporters caught up with her later that afternoon, she offered no further comment. Her office issued a short written statement, reiterating her commitment to transparency and her belief that powerful people should not be insulated from scrutiny simply because of status or influence. There were no follow-up interviews, no media tours. Her decision to stay quiet only magnified the impact of what had been said in the hearing. In Trump's circle, that silence was interpreted not as indifference, but as confidence. There was no scrambling from her end, no attempts to justify or clarify. She had laid the documents on the table and walked away. That unshaken calm became a talking point among political strategists. A Republican advisor, speaking anonymously to a news outlet, admitted that Crockett's demeanor had made it harder to frame her as radical or unhinged, a strategy that had been successfully used against other critics of Trump in the past. What she had done instead was reframe the conversation. Rather than chasing headlines or trying to provoke a soundbite, she had moved the discussion into the realm of evidence and institutional accountability. And while Trump's camp worked behind the scenes to determine how to respond, Crockett offered nothing for them to latch onto. No name-calling, no accusations, just proof. Her control in that moment, not just of her presentation, but of herself, set the tone for everything that followed. It left political commentators unsure of how to spin the event. It left Trump without a clear counterattack. And it left the public with a rare impression that someone had chosen to prioritize facts over fanfare, even when the facts pointed directly at one of the most powerful men in the country. The aftermath of Jasmine Crockett's live takedown was not defined by loud declarations or fiery rebuttals. It was marked by a growing, uneasy quiet across media platforms, in political circles, and within Trump's own orbit. The response was cautious and fractured. It was clear that something had shifted. The hearing had not just reintroduced old allegations, it had reframed them with fresh documentation, official record status, and a level of detail that stripped away plausible deniability. Crockett's methodical approach had done more than expose potential contradictions in Trump's past denials. It had set a new precedent for how sensitive information could be revealed in a congressional setting without devolving into spectacle. Her refusal to embellish allowed the material to speak for itself, and the silence that followed was not apathy, it was recognition. Recognition that what had been presented could not be easily brushed aside. For Trump, the silence became its own narrative. His absence from the usual media cycle, even for a brief period, created speculation not just about what he would say, but about what he could say. Advisors danced around questions. Legal teams became more visible behind the scenes. Former allies in Congress began offering half-hearted defenses or avoiding the subject entirely. In contrast to his usual media dominance, Trump found himself in the rare position of playing defense, with very little leverage. This wasn't just another round of political mudslinging. The public could see that. These were not internet rumors or opposition talking points. They were flight manifests, photographs, and documented exchanges. And while the materials didn't prove criminal activity, they raised serious ethical and reputational concerns. They placed Trump in the middle of a network he had repeatedly tried to distance himself from. And this time, the evidence came from a sitting congresswoman speaking under oath, not from tabloids or Twitter threads. What Crockett had done, intentionally or not, was shift the burden of proof. Rather than trying to convince people of Trump's guilt, she simply laid out a trail of verifiable data and walked away. That act alone forced a reevaluation not just among the public, but within the machinery of political commentary. And for Trump, whose entire public persona had long been built on dominance, defiance, and control over the narrative, this kind of fact-based dismantling was particularly damaging because it offered no clear target to fight. In the days that followed, the conversation only grew, not because Crockett kept talking, but because she didn't need to. Her silence after the hearing was the loudest message of all. The evidence stood on its own, and in that quiet, many began asking the one question Trump has spent years avoiding. What exactly does he have to